Julian Ward had spent 15 years making himself invisible. As a forensic auditor at Sterling & Cross, one of the most respected private financial investigation firms in the capital, his job was to find what others wanted hidden: fractions of percentages, phantom transactions, numbers that did not breathe but could still kill a career. He worked from a windowless office on the 14th floor, surrounded by screens that glowed in the dim light like aquarium tanks for data. His colleagues admired his precision and feared his silence. He was the man called when something had to be proven without a shred of doubt. When Richard Sterling, a senior director at the firm's parent bank, suddenly announced his retirement at 53, the partners felt a familiar unease. Sterling had been the architect of a complex international portfolio, and his departure left loose threads. Julian was assigned to review the files, a routine sweep meant to ensure compliance before the accounts were handed over. He accepted the task as he accepted all others, without enthusiasm, without resistance, with only the quiet certainty that numbers did not lie. He did not know that this routine would dismantle his life in less than 72 hours. He began to review methodically, pulling transaction records from the past decade and running them through the firm's standard verification algorithms. Everything appeared clean until he noticed a subsidiary account that had been flagged for manual review years earlier but never investigated. The flag had been buried under layers of administrative overrides, each one authorized by someone with executive clearance. Julian made a note to examine that subsidiary more closely. It was the first step into a labyrinth that had been designed to keep people like him out. The anomaly appeared on a Tuesday afternoon, hidden inside a spreadsheet of transaction logs spanning 8 years. Julian had been cross-referencing currency conversion fees when he noticed a pattern so faint it might have been a rounding error. 1 cent was being deducted from every interbank transfer that passed through a specific subsidiary account. The deduction occurred after all official fees were calculated, buried beneath layers of encryption keys that should have been stripped during the audit process. He followed the thread deeper, bypassing the standard summary reports to examine raw ledger data. What he found made him lean back in his chair, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Over 8 years, the subsidiary had processed nearly 200 million transactions across 3 continents. 1 cent per transaction amounted to $2 million, funds that had been diverted into a shadow account registered under a dissolved shell company. The money had not simply disappeared, it had been carefully routed to pay for something off the books. Julian cross-referenced the withdrawal patterns and discovered they coincided with the timing of 4 major regulatory investigations in different countries. The cent had been buying silence. And Richard Sterling had not retired. He had vanished 48 hours before Julian opened the first file. Julian spent the next several hours documenting every link, creating a separate encrypted archive that he stored on a portable drive he kept hidden inside a hollowed-out book on his desk. He did not share his findings with anyone. His training had taught him that evidence was only useful if it could be presented intact. He planned to show his superior, Marcus Cole, the following morning. That night, he barely slept. The numbers replayed behind his eyelids, forming a map of corruption that seemed too vast to belong to the firm he had trusted for so long. Julian printed a single page of summarized findings and carried it to the office of his direct superior, Marcus Cole, a man who wore expensive suits and spoke in the polished tones of corporate loyalty. Cole scanned the page, his expression unreadable, then closed the document and asked Julian to wait while he made a phone call. For 15 minutes, Julian stood by the window, watching the evening lights flicker on across the city. When Cole returned, he was accompanied by 2 men in dark jackets whom Julian had never seen before. Cole informed Julian that he was being placed on administrative leave pending a review of his conduct. The reason, Cole explained with rehearsed calm, was a discrepancy in Julian's own certification logs from a case 3 years earlier, a minor oversight that had suddenly become a matter of compliance. Julian understood immediately. They were burying him before he could speak. He tried to argue, to point out that the Sterling file was still open, but the two men flanked him and escorted him to the elevator. His keycard was deactivated as the doors closed. By the time he reached the lobby, his corporate email had already been wiped, and a notice of termination was being drafted. He walked out into the city with nothing but the clothes he wore and the memory of what he had seen. He still had the portable drive in his pocket, but he knew that if they discovered it, his situation would become far more dangerous. He took a circuitous route home, switching trains 3 times and walking through a crowded market to ensure he was not being followed. When he finally reached his apartment, he found his wife Elena waiting with dinner on the table. She took one look at his face and set down the plates without a word. He told her he had lost his job. He did not yet tell her why. Elena found him sitting in the dark of their apartment 3 hours later. She was 5 months pregnant, an architect who worked from home, and she had grown accustomed to her husband's late hours but not to his silence. Julian explained what had happened, his voice flat and controlled, as if he were still narrating a report. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she asked only one question: could he prove it? He told her that the evidence was on the firm's encrypted servers, now inaccessible. But he had memorized the key patterns, the account numbers, the timestamps, the routing codes. His memory had always been his most dangerous asset. Over the next 2 days, he used public library computers and a prepaid mobile device to reconstruct the framework of the scheme. He did not have the original files, but he had enough to outline the structure: a network of dormant accounts feeding into a central node controlled by an entity registered in a jurisdiction that no longer existed. He traced the largest withdrawals to dates that matched crucial votes in 2 parliamentary committees and 1 judicial appointment. The money had bought outcomes. But before he could take the next step, his apartment door was broken open at 3 in the morning, and 3 men with professional restraint ransacked the place while Julian and Elena stood against the wall, hands raised. They took nothing of value. They only took his notes, his laptop, and every copy of his work. They did not speak, but their message was unmistakable. After they left, Julian found that the portable drive he had hidden inside the heating vent was still there. They had not known where to look. He sat on the floor with the drive in his palm and realized that the next time they would not limit themselves to property. The message was clear: stop, or the next visit would not end with a warning. Julian moved Elena to a small hotel outside the city center, paying with cash he withdrew from a joint account he had opened years ago under a different name, a habit born from cases that had taught him how easily finances could be weaponized. He told her to wait, to tell no one, and to use only the prepaid phone he left with her. Then he disappeared into the city's transit system, becoming one of the thousands of faces that pass through metro stations and bus depots each day. He had one advantage: the men who came for him knew he was an auditor, not an investigator. They expected him to run, to hide, to fade into obscurity. Instead, he began searching for Richard Sterling. The director had left a trail, not of documents, but of habits. Sterling had always preferred cash for personal expenses. Julian knew from old expense reports that he frequented 3 specific establishments in the Port District, where transactions were recorded on paper rather than in digital ledgers. It took 4 days of patient inquiry, but a bartender at a nearly abandoned oyster bar remembered Sterling's last visit and the nervous conversation he had had with a man who arrived carrying a leather satchel. The man had left first. Sterling had finished his drink and never returned. Julian asked about the satchel, and the bartender described a logo that Julian recognized: a courier service known for handling sensitive legal documents. That courier operated out of an unmarked office near the docks. Julian knew that if Sterling had sent anything through them, there would be a record, and he intended to find it before anyone else did. Julian's search took him to the outskirts of the city, where industrial zones gave way to forgotten residential blocks built for factory workers decades ago. Sterling's name appeared on no lease, but Julian found him through a utility bill paid in cash at a local post office, a method that left a paper trail too slow for most pursuers but visible to someone who knew exactly where to look. The building was a concrete slab with cracked balconies, and Sterling answered the door after the third knock, his face pale and lined with the exhaustion of a man who had been running for weeks. He did not seem surprised to see Julian. He stepped aside and let him in. The apartment was sparse, a mattress on the floor, a suitcase half-packed, a single laptop with its screen cracked in one corner. Sterling offered no excuses, no justification. He simply sat on the edge of the mattress and told Julian the truth. The $2 million had been the start. The real operation had grown to involve money from 12 different institutions, all funneled through the subsidiary, all used to secure favorable rulings, licenses, and investigations that were opened and then quietly closed. Sterling had been the architect, but he had also been a target. When he tried to withdraw, they had threatened his family. He had run because running was the only way to keep them safe. He showed Julian photographs on his cracked laptop, images of his wife and daughter, both living under assumed identities in a small town across the border. Sterling explained that the men who came for him were not employees of the bank. They worked for a private intelligence firm that the network retained to handle problems. Julian asked why Sterling had not gone to the authorities. Sterling laughed bitterly and pointed to a newspaper clipping he had kept, a magistrate who had been appointed after one of the suspicious withdrawals. That magistrate now oversaw the very court that would hear any financial crime case. The system had been captured from within. Sterling revealed that the evidence Julian had found was only the surface layer. The real proof, a collection of encrypted transaction logs, internal memos, and recordings of conversations with officials from 3 countries, was stored on a set of drives that Sterling had hidden before fleeing. He had buried them in a location known only to himself, a failsafe in case the people who controlled the scheme decided to eliminate him. Julian asked why Sterling had not already released the evidence, and Sterling leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper as he explained. Releasing the files without a strategy would be suicide. The network extended into law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and the highest levels of financial regulation. Any journalist or prosecutor who received the data would be compromised before they could act. Sterling had been waiting for someone who understood the architecture of the fraud well enough to present it in a way that could not be ignored or buried. Julian realized then that Sterling had known he would come. The director had left the scent pattern deliberately, as a breadcrumb that only a forensic auditor of Julian's caliber would notice. Sterling asked Julian if he was willing to see it through. Julian thought of Elena, of the apartment ransacked, of the men who had made him stand against the wall. He nodded once. Sterling gave him a set of coordinates scribbled on a torn piece of paper, a storage facility 2 hours north of the city, where he had rented a unit under a false name 5 years earlier. Inside that unit were the drives, along with a letter addressed to the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Sterling had prepared everything except the one thing he could not provide, a survivor to deliver it. Julian left Sterling's apartment before dawn, taking a regional train north with nothing but a backpack and the paper coordinates. He changed trains twice and walked the final 3 kilometers along a highway shoulder, arriving at the storage facility as morning fog settled over the surrounding fields. The unit was a small garage-style locker at the far end of a gravel lot. Julian used the key Sterling had given him to open the padlock, and inside he found a metal footlocker wrapped in plastic sheeting. He cut the plastic open with a pocket knife and discovered 3 encrypted hard drives, a sealed envelope, and a prepaid phone that had been powered off. He placed everything into his backpack, relocked the unit, and left the same way he had come. On the train back to the city, he used the prepaid phone to call the only number stored in its memory. A woman answered with a single word, "Yes." Julian identified himself and said he had the package. The woman told him to go to a specific cafe in the Old Quarter at 3 o'clock and to wait for a man who would be reading a newspaper printed in a foreign language. Julian agreed, then powered off the phone and removed its battery. He spent the remaining hours in a public library, reviewing the contents of the drives using a computer terminal that he wiped clean after each session. The recordings were damning: conversations between bank executives and government officials, detailed ledgers of payments made to influence investigations, and a confidential memorandum outlining the structure of the entire scheme. Julian copied key excerpts onto a separate encrypted drive that he kept hidden in his sock. He now carried 2 sets of evidence, one to deliver, and one to ensure that if anything happened to him, the truth would still survive. The cafe was small and crowded, the kind of place where conversations dissolved into the noise of espresso machines and clattering cups. Julian arrived early and took a seat near the window, watching the street for anyone who seemed out of place. At precisely 3 o'clock, a man entered carrying a newspaper in a language Julian did not recognize. He was middle-aged, dressed in a plain coat, with the unhurried movements of someone who had spent years waiting in public places. He sat across from Julian without being invited and ordered a coffee in the local language. Julian slid the sealed envelope across the table. The man opened it, read the letter Sterling had written, and then looked at Julian with an expression that conveyed neither approval nor judgment. He asked Julian if he understood what he was handing over. Julian said he understood. The man explained that the International Criminal Court had been investigating similar patterns for 18 months but lacked the internal documentation to move forward. Sterling's evidence would allow them to request the transfer of several cases from national jurisdictions, effectively removing the scheme from the reach of compromised local authorities. The process would take time, and Julian would need to remain hidden until the arrests were executed. Julian asked how long. The man said it could be weeks, possibly months. He then gave Julian a prepaid phone with a number programmed into it and told him to keep it with him at all times. When the time came, they would call. Until then, Julian was to tell no one else about the drives. The man finished his coffee, folded his newspaper, and left without saying goodbye. Julian remained in the cafe for another hour, letting the anonymity of the crowd wrap around him. Julian returned to the hotel where Elena was waiting and found her sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands folded over her stomach. She had not slept well in his absence, but she did not ask where he had been. He told her only that he had delivered the evidence to people who could use it and that they needed to stay out of sight for a while longer. She accepted this with the same quiet strength she had shown since the night their apartment was broken into. They moved twice over the following weeks, never staying in one place long enough to leave a trace. Julian paid for everything with cash and used false names for hotel registrations. He avoided using his phone or any device that could be tracked. The prepaid phone from the man at the cafe remained in his pocket, silent, waiting. During the days, he walked through parks and shopping districts, watching for anyone who seemed to be watching him. At night, he and Elena talked about the future in vague terms, careful not to make plans that might be disrupted. The only constant was the second encrypted drive he kept hidden, the copy of the evidence that would outlive him if necessary. As the weeks stretched into 2 months, doubt began to creep into his thoughts. He wondered if the man at the cafe had been legitimate, if the evidence had been suppressed again, if Sterling had been found and made to reveal everything. Then, on a gray Tuesday morning, the prepaid phone rang. Julian answered to a voice he did not recognize, which gave him an address and a time. The voice said 3 words, "It is done." Julian hung up and sat in silence for a long moment. Elena asked him what had happened. He told her that it was over. The address was a nondescript office building in the diplomatic quarter, where international organizations maintained a presence far from the reach of local authorities. Julian arrived at the appointed time and was escorted by a security officer to a conference room on the 3rd floor. Inside, 3 people sat behind a long table, a woman from the International Criminal Court, a man from a joint financial intelligence unit, and a prosecutor whose name Julian recognized from news reports about cross-border corruption cases. They informed Julian that simultaneous arrests had been carried out in 4 countries during the night. 12 individuals had been taken into custody, including 2 bank executives, a former government minister, and the head of the private intelligence firm that had ransacked his apartment. The magistrate whose appointment had been bought was already under investigation. The evidence from Sterling's drives had been authenticated and matched with other cases that were now being consolidated into a single prosecution. Julian was asked if he would be willing to testify when the trial began. He said he would. The prosecutor then informed Julian that his name had been cleared within the financial industry. The false discrepancies in his certification logs had been exposed as retaliatory fabrications. He was free to return to his profession, though the prosecutor added with a hint of dry humor that he might find his former employer no longer in business. The bank had been placed under provisional administration, and its remaining executives were cooperating with investigators in exchange for reduced charges. Julian listened to all of this with a calm that surprised him. He had spent so long preparing for the worst that he had forgotten what it felt like to receive good news. Julian left the diplomatic quarter and walked for an hour through the city, feeling the weight of the past months begin to lift from his shoulders. He stopped at a public phone and called Elena, who was waiting at yet another hotel. He told her to pack their things, that they were going home. She asked if it was safe, and he said yes. When he arrived at the hotel, she was standing outside with their 2 suitcases and a small bag for the baby that she had packed weeks earlier, just in case. They took a taxi back to their apartment, which they had not seen since the night it was ransacked. The door had been repaired, and inside, the landlord had arranged for a cleaning service to remove the debris left by the intruders. The furniture was still there, though the drawers remained empty where his notes had been taken. Julian walked through each room slowly, remembering the life he had built before the numbers on a screen had dismantled everything. He opened the window in the living room and let the city noise fill the space. Elena came to stand beside him, resting her hand on his arm. She asked if he regretted it, finding the scent, following the trail, losing his job and nearly losing everything else. He shook his head. He told her that the only thing he regretted was that it had taken him so long to understand that some truths were worth more than the safety of silence. She leaned against him, and they stood there in silence as the afternoon light shifted across the walls. 3 months later, Julian sat in a courtroom across from the men who had ordered the search of his home. The proceedings were broadcast through a secure feed to 3 other countries where co-defendants were being tried simultaneously. Julian testified for 2 days, his voice steady, his recollection of account numbers and routing codes as precise as it had been when he first discovered the pattern. He did not look at the defendants except when asked to identify them. The prosecutor later told him that his testimony had been the foundation upon which the entire case was built. Sterling, who had been found and brought into protective custody before the arrests, testified as well, though his appearance was delayed by security concerns that Julian understood all too well. In the end, all 12 defendants were convicted on charges of money laundering, bribery, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The sentences ranged from 7 to 20 years. The magistrate was removed from office, and new oversight committees were established to prevent similar schemes from taking root again. Julian returned to forensic auditing, but not with his old firm. He started a small independent practice, taking cases that involved public accountability rather than private profit. Elena gave birth to a daughter 3 weeks after the trial ended. They named her after no one in particular, a fresh name for a fresh start. Julian kept the second encrypted drive in a safe deposit box, though he never needed to use it. It served as a reminder that the truth, once found, could not be unfound. And sometimes, against all odds, it was enough.